"We'll do what I want," Drake said as they checked into their hotel. "I've planned everything." Esther tried to protest. "But I wanted to visit the Burj Khalifa, and the—" "You'll do as I say," Drake interrupted, his voice cold. "I'm the man in this relationship, and you'll respect my decisions." Esther bit her tongue. But the tension between them grew with each passing day. One evening, as they dined at a fancy restaurant, Drake criticized her appearance. "You should wear more makeup," he said, eyeing her critically. "You look too plain." Esther felt a pang of hurt but said nothing. She had always been confident in her natural beauty, but Drake's words made her feel inadequate. Esther felt like she was living with a stranger, one who demanded control over every aspect of her life. By the end of the honeymoon, Drake's behavior had grown worse. He insisted Esther quit her job, claiming it was beneath her as his wife, and she had to move with him to Delta State. "You don't need to work," he said. "I make enough money for both of us. Your job is to take care of the house and me." Esther tried to stand her ground. "I love my job, Drake. It's important to me." Drake's eyes narrowed. "I'm your husband, and I've made my decision. You'll quit and move with me to Delta, or there will be consequences." Esther felt as if she was back in her parents' house enduring another lecture about her marital life. She had never seen this side of Drake before, and it terrified her. Reluctantly, she handed in her resignation when they got back to Lagos, feeling like she was losing a part of herself. Their first major fight happened a few weeks later. Esther had traveled to Lagos to visit her parents because she was lonely in the house while Drake was away on a business trip. When she returned to meet him at home, he was furious. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I went to see my parents," Esther replied, trying to stay calm. "You didn't ask me for permission," Drake shouted. "You don't make such decisions without me." Esther's temper flared. "I'm not a child, Drake. I can travel and visit my parents if I want to." Drake's face turned red with anger. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "You'll learn to respect me, or you'll regret it." Esther pulled away, her heart pounding. This was the first time Drake had been physically aggressive, and it shook her to her core. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and she didn't know how much longer she could endure it. Esther's life became a cycle of fear and control. Drake's verbal abuse escalated, and his temper grew shorter with each passing day. The once sweet and loving Drake she knew was now short-tempered and easily irritable. One evening, after a long day of isolation at home, Esther decided to call her mother. "Mommy, I need to talk to you," Esther said, her voice trembling. "What is it, my daughter?" her mother asked, concern evident in her tone. "Drake. He's not the man we thought he was. He's controlling, and he hurts me," Esther confessed, tears streaming down her face. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Esther, marriage is not easy. You have to be patient and pray. Drake is a good man. He'll change." Esther's heart sank. "Mama, you don't understand. I'm scared. Just give it time, my daughter. Everything will be fine," her mother said before ending the call. Esther sat in silence, feeling more alone than ever. She had hoped her parents would understand, but instead, they dismissed her concerns. That night, Drake came home late, his mood dark. When Esther asked where he had been, he exploded. "You think you can question me?" he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I'm the man of this house. You have no right to ask me anything." Esther tried to back away, but Drake grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "Where do you think you're going?" "I'm not done talking to you," he snarled. It was the first time he had physically hurt her, and Esther felt a wave of sheer terror. She knew then that she was in danger. Drake's control over Esther grew tighter. He cut her off from her friends and family, monitoring her every move. "You don't need to see anyone," he said when she asked to visit her parents. "I'm the only family you need." He took her phone, claiming she didn't need it, and restricted her access to the internet. Esther felt like a prisoner in her own home. One day, while Drake was away at work, Esther managed to sneak out to escape to the interstate bus terminal and travel to Lagos to see her family. She hoped to visit them and ask for help. Since she got married, she had been living in Delta, a city she wasn't familiar with. So as she made her way out of the house, she walked into Drake. "Where do you think you're going?" his voice hissed in her ear. Esther froze. I just wanted to get some fresh air. Drake grabbed her arm, his grip painful as he pushed her back into the house. You don't leave the house without my permission. Do you understand? Now go inside and prepare my dinner. Esther nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She was trapped, and there seemed to be no way out. One afternoon, while Drake was away at work, Esther found an old phone hidden in a drawer. It was cracked and barely functional, but it had a SIM card. With trembling hands, she turned it on and dialed Ruth's number. "Ruth, it's me," Esther whispered when her friend answered. "Esther? Oh my God, where have you been? I've been so worried," Ruth exclaimed. "I'm in trouble," Esther said, her voice breaking. "Since I came with Drake to live in Delta, he treats me like his prisoner. I tried to travel to Lagos a few days ago, but I got sent back home," she sobbed. "Sent back home? By who?" "I don't understand what you're saying," Ruth replied. "By Drake. He's not who we thought he was. He's controlling and he hurts me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Esther, you need to leave him. Come to Lagos and stay with me. I'll help you." Esther felt a ray of hope lift her spirits. "I'll try, Ruth. But it's not easy. He watches me all the time." "Be careful," Ruth said. "And call me as soon as you can. I'll be here for you." Esther ended the call and hid the phone, her heart racing. For the first time in months, she felt like there might be a way out. Esther began secretly planning her escape. She packed a small bag with essentials and hid it under the bed, waiting for the right moment. But Drake's suspicions grew, and he began watching her even more closely. One evening, as Esther was preparing dinner, Drake stormed into the kitchen. "What are you hiding?" he demanded, his eyes blazing. "Nothing," Esther replied, her voice steady despite her fear. Drake grabbed her neck, his grip painful. "Don't lie to me. I know you've been sneaking around. What are you planning?" Esther's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "I'm not planning anything. I just want to live my life." Drake's face twisted with anger. "Your life is with me. You belong to me." He shoved her against the wall, his hands tightening around her throat. Esther struggled to breathe, her vision blurring. "You'll never leave me," Drake snarled. "Do you understand?" Esther nodded, tears streaming down her face. When he finally released her, she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Esther knew she had to act quickly. The next day, while Drake was still fast asleep, she grabbed her hidden bag and made a run for it. She hailed a taxi to get to the bus terminal, her heart pounding with fear. But as the taxi pulled up to the terminal, Drake's car cornered them, forcing the driver to hit the curb. "Esther!" he shouted, jumping out of the car. Esther froze, her heart racing. Drake grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. "You thought you could leave me," he hissed, his eyes wild with anger. Esther struggled, but Drake was too strong. He dragged her back to the car, ignoring her pleas for help. As they drove home, Esther felt a wave of despair. Her escape had failed, and she was more trapped than ever. After the failed escape attempt, Drake's abuse became even more severe. He locked Esther in the house, refusing to let her leave even for groceries. "You've proven you can't be trusted," he said, his voice cold. "You'll stay here until you learn your place." Esther felt like a prisoner, her spirit breaking with each passing day. She tried to reach out to Ruth again, but Drake had confiscated the old phone, leaving her completely isolated. One evening, Drake came home drunk, his mood darker than usual. He stumbled into the living room, where Esther was sitting quietly, and glared at her. "Why do you look so miserable?" he slurred. "I've given you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Esther stayed silent, afraid to provoke him, but her silence only angered him more. "Answer me," he shouted, grabbing her arm and yanking her to her feet. "I'm sorry," Esther whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Sorry isn't enough," Drake snarled. He raised his hand and struck her across the face, the force of the blow sending her crashing to the floor. Esther lay there, her cheek burning, her body trembling with fear. She knew then that she couldn't stay any longer. She had to find a way out, no matter the cost. Esther's health began to deteriorate. The constant stress and abuse took a toll on her body, and she grew weaker with each passing day. Drake refused to let her see a doctor, dismissing her complaints as drama. One night, during an unprovoked fight, Drake shoved Esther down the stairs. She tumbled down the stairs, hitting her head on the solid concrete floor multiple times. By the time she landed at the foot of the stairs, her body had given out, unable to withstand the abuse any longer. Drake panicked when he realized she wasn't moving. He called for help, but it was too late. By the time the ambulance arrived, Esther was gone. The news of her death sent shockwaves through her family. Her parents, friends, and relatives were devastated, unable to comprehend how such a vibrant young woman could be gone so suddenly. Esther's parents were consumed by guilt and regret. They had set her up to date and forced her to marry Drake, ignoring her wishes and dismissing her fears. "We should have listened to her," her mother sobbed, clutching Esther's photograph. "We failed her." Her father sat in silence, his face etched with grief. "We thought we were doing what was best for her, but we were wrong." The house felt empty without Esther. Her mother, Mrs. Johnson, sat on the edge of Esther's old bed, clutching a photograph of her smiling face. The room was still filled with some of Esther's things: her books, her clothes, and her old music player. It was as if she had just stepped out and would return any moment. But she wouldn't. Mrs. Johnson's hands trembled as she traced the edges of the photo. "Why didn't I listen to you, my child?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't I see what was happening?" Her husband, Mr. Johnson, stood in the doorway, his face wrinkled as if it carried the whole world's grief. "We failed her," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "We pushed her into that marriage. We didn't listen when she tried to tell us." Mrs. Johnson looked up, her eyes blazing with determination. "We can't bring her back, but we can make sure Drake pays for what he did. We owe her that much." Mr. Johnson nodded. "I will make sure that animal Drake rots in hell for what he did to my daughter." "We start by gathering evidence," Mrs. Johnson said firmly. "Everything we can find. Medical records, photos, anything that shows what he did to her." She picked up her phone and dialed Ruth's number. "Ruth, it's Mrs. Johnson," she said when her daughter's best friend answered. "We need your help. We're going to fight for Esther." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm with you, Auntie," Ruth said. "Whatever you need, I'll do it." Ruth and Esther's parents traveled to Delta State and visited the police station to file a murder case against Drake. The police station was crowded, and the air was thick with tension. Mrs. Johnson sat across from a tired-looking officer, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We want to file a report," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Our daughter was killed by her husband. We have evidence." The officer sighed, flipping through a stack of papers. "Do you have proof that he killed her? Witnesses? A confession?" "We have medical records," Mrs. Johnson said, sliding a folder across the table. "And witnesses who saw him abuse her." The officer glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "Look, madam, these cases are complicated. Without solid evidence, there's not much we can do." Mrs. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying you won't even investigate?" The officer leaned back in his chair. "I'm saying it's not that simple. Your son-in-law is a wealthy man. These things take time." Mr. Johnson, who had been silent until now, slammed his hand on the table. "Our daughter is dead. How much more proof do you need?" The officer raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I understand your frustration, but we have to follow procedure." Mrs. Johnson stood up, her voice cold. "If you won't help us, we'll find someone who will." She grabbed the folder and walked out, her husband and Ruth following close behind. Back at the hotel where they lodged, Ruth sat at her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She had spent hours drafting a post about Esther's story, pouring her heart into every word. "This has to be perfect," she muttered to herself. "People need to know what happened to her." She clicked post and watched as the message went live. #Justice for Esther. "My best friend Esther was a bright, beautiful soul. She was forced into a marriage she didn't want, and it cost her her life. Her husband, Drake, abused her for months, and no one listened when she cried for help. Now she's gone, and we demand justice. Share her story. Don't let her death be in vain." Within minutes, the post began to spread. Comments poured in, some expressing sympathy, others outrage. "This is heartbreaking," one person wrote. "We need to hold him accountable," another commented. Ruth's phone buzzed with notifications. She scrolled through the messages, her heart pounding. "It's working," she whispered. "People are listening." Mr. David, the lawyer Esther's parents contacted for help, adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the documents spread across his desk. The case was complex, but he had handled worse. "This Drake fellow," he said, looking up at them. "He's wealthy and well-connected within this state. It won't be easy to take him down." "We're not asking for easy," Mr. Johnson said firmly. "We're asking for justice." Mr. David nodded. "I'll take the case. Pro bono. But you need to understand, this will be a long, difficult fight." "We're ready," Ruth said. "Whatever it takes." Mr. David leaned forward, his expression serious. "First, we need to gather as much evidence as possible. Medical records, witness testimonies, anything that shows a pattern of abuse." "We've already started," Mrs. Johnson said, handing him a folder. "This is everything we have so far." Mr. David flipped through the documents, his eyes narrowing. "This is good. Very good. But we'll need more. We'll also need to flip one of Drake's domestic staff to our side. There's got to be one of them who wants to see him suffer for what he did." A few days later, Drake's housekeeper, Mama Joy, sat nervously in Mr. David's office, clutching a cup of tea. "I worked for Mr. Drake for 2 years, she said, her voice trembling. "I saw how he treated Esther. He was always shouting, always angry. One time, he hit her so hard she fell to the floor." Mrs. Johnson's hands clenched into fists, but she remained silent, letting Mama Joy speak. "I wanted to help her," Mama Joy continued, tears streaming down her face. "But I was afraid. He threatened to fire me if I said anything." Mr. David leaned forward. "Would you be willing to testify in court?" Mama Joy hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. For Esther I will." Ruth's story announcing Esther's death on social media had gone viral. "Auntie, look at this," Ruth said, thrusting her laptop at Mrs. Johnson. The hashtag Justice for Esther was trending nationwide, with thousands sharing Esther's photo and demanding action. But not everyone was supportive. Drake's allies flooded social media with lies. Esther was unstable, one post claimed. She caused her own death. Ruth slammed her laptop shut. "How can people believe this rubbish?" "They're scared," Mrs. Johnson said grimly. "Drake has money and power. But we have the truth." The next day, protesters gathered outside the Delta State Police headquarters. Women held placards, "Break the silence," and "No more Esthers." Ruth stood on a makeshift stage, her voice shaking with fury. "Esther was my best friend," she shouted into the microphone. "She was kind, smart, and full of life. Her husband stole that from her. And we won't let him get away with it." The crowd roared in agreement. For the first time, Mrs. Johnson felt like it was possible to get justice and avenge Esther's painful death. In another part of the city, Drake slammed his fist on the mahogany desk in his lawyer's office, his face twisted with rage. "Fix this," he barked at his lawyer, Mr. Graham, a slick, silver-haired man known for defending the country's elite. "Calm down, Mr. Drake," Graham said, sipping his whiskey. "The court respects wealth. We'll discredit the girl and bury the evidence." "How?" "We'll say she was mentally unstable, maybe even suicidal." Graham smirked. "I've done this before. Trust me." Drake leaned back, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Do that and make it hurt." Meanwhile, the Johnsons faced their own battle. Mr. David stormed into their hotel room, clutching a legal document. Drake's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss the case. They're claiming Esther's death was an accident, a fall down the stairs. Mr. Johnson's face paled. "But the medical report. They've bribed a doctor to back their story," Mr. David interrupted. "We need stronger evidence. Fast." Ruth scrolled through her phone, her eyes widening. "Look, someone just sent me a video showing Drake driving his car out of their estate the night Esther died. He wasn't out of town like he claimed." Mr. David grinned. "That's our break. We must connect with that person as soon as possible. Also, I have good news from my private investigator. He has located the taxi driver who drove Esther to the bus terminal the day she planned to escape to Lagos. The taxi driver, Mr. Adam, lived in a cramped apartment in Mushin. When Mr. David and Ruth knocked on his door, he peered through the door chain, his eyes wary. "I don't want any trouble," he said. We're not here to cause any, Ruth said gently. We just want to talk about the woman you drove that day. Her name was Esther. Her husband killed her, and we know you witnessed some of his abuse on her. Mr. Adam hesitated, then opened the door. His voice dropped to a whisper. She was crying as she begged me to drive faster. Then that man, her husband, chased us. He cornered us, forcefully took her into his car, and drove off. I didn't want to get involved. But you are involved, Mr. David said. Esther's dead now. You're a witness to the abuse she suffered from her husband and her fear of him. Mr. Adam looked down, guilt etched on his face. I have a family. If I testify, won't the husband come after me? Ruth stepped forward. Esther didn't have a choice. But you do. Please help us. You know it's the right thing to do. After a long silence, Mr. Adam nodded. Okay, I'll do it. The day of the trial finally arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters crammed into the benches, and protesters crowded outside. Drake sat at the defense table, looking smug in a tailored suit. The prosecutor, Ms. Janet, opened with a fiery statement. Esther Dennis was a victim of domestic abuse and cruelty. Mr. Drake Dennis, her husband, robbed her of her voice, her freedom, and finally her life. Today we give her a voice. Drake's lawyer countered with a sneer. Esther was unstable. She fabricated stories of abuse and tragically fell during a panic attack. Mrs. Johnson gripped her husband's hand, her nails digging into his palm. Lies, she muttered. The first witness was Mama Joy. She described Drake's rages, her voice shaking. He hit her. Many times. I saw the bruises. Drake smirked, scribbling notes for his lawyer. Then the taxi driver, Mr. Adam, took the stand. Esther was terrified that day. She kept saying, "He'll kill me if he finds me." He drove dangerously and cornered us before forcefully taking her back into his car. Drake's smile faded as he looked at the taxi driver with murderous intent. The prosecution saved the worst for last. Ms. Janet played the footage from the night Esther died, clearly showing Drake driving his car out of his estate gate. Your alibi is a lie, she said coldly. You were in Delta, not Abuja. Drake's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Then, Ms. Janet called Drake to the stand. Did you beat your wife, Mr. Dennis? Never, Drake said, his jaw clenched. Then explain this. She projected photos of Esther's injuries, bruises, a split lip, a broken arm. Drake's composure cracked. She fell. I told you she was clumsy. Clumsy? Ms. Janet raised an eyebrow. 4 falls in 6 months? Or was she clumsy every time you raised your hand? The crowd erupted. The judge slammed his gavel. Order! Drake leaped to his feet, pointing at Mrs. Johnson. You did this. You turned everyone against me. The judge glared. Control your client, Mr. Graham, or I'll hold him in contempt. As Drake was dragged out, shouting curses, Mrs. Johnson allowed herself a small, grim smile. Esther, we're almost there. Order was restored after a 10-minute recess. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Esther's parents and Ruth sat together, looking at Drake as he looked nervously. Across the room, Drake sat slumped in his chair, his tailored suit wrinkled, his smugness replaced by a sheen of sweat. The judge's entrance made everyone rise, the scrape of chairs echoing like a drum roll. All rise for the Honorable Justice Gloria, the bailiff announced. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, settled into her seat and motioned for the room to follow. She adjusted her glasses and began flipping through the final documents. Mrs. Johnson's heart pounded so loudly she feared the entire room could hear it. This case, Justice Gloria began, her voice firm, has laid bare the darkest corners of human cruelty. Esther Johnson was a woman whose life was stolen by arrogance and violence. The evidence presented leaves no room for doubt. Drake's lawyer, Mr. Graham, opened his mouth to object, but a single glare from the judge silenced him. Mr. Drake Dennis, she continued, you have been found guilty of the manslaughter of Esther Johnson. Your actions were deliberate, calculated, and devoid of humanity. You manipulated, isolated, and brutalized a woman who deserved safety, respect, and love. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Drake shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is nonsense. I did nothing wrong. The judge ignored him. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison. with no possibility of parole. May this verdict serve as a warning to those who believe wealth and power place them above the law. The crowd erupted. Cheers, tears, and shouts of justice for Esther filled the air. Mrs. Johnson collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing. Ruth hugged Mama Joy and Mr. Adam, their faces streaked with tears. Outside the courthouse, the sun blazed overhead as reporters swarmed the family. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Today, justice has been served," she said. "But this is not the end. My daughter's name will never be forgotten. We will fight for every woman trapped in silence, and every family broken by cruelty. Esther's light will guide us." A reporter shouted, "What's next for your family?" Mr. Johnson answered, his arm around his wife. "We will honor Esther by ensuring no one suffers as she did. This is only the beginning." As the crowd chanted Esther's name, Ruth pulled Mrs. Johnson aside. "Esther would be proud," she whispered. Mrs. Johnson smiled through her tears. "She is proud. And she's finally free." Inside the courthouse, Drake was led away in handcuffs, his shouts fading into the shadows. "You think you've won? I'll appeal. I'll ruin you all." But no one listened. The world had already moved on, carrying Esther's story forward. A story of pain, courage, and the unyielding fight for justice.